Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story.
In the still hours after midnight, on a quiet street of narrow brick row houses in South Philadelphia, the calm was broken by a single, concussive blast. Windows rattled up and down the block. Porch lights snapped on. Startled neighbors stepped out into the chill March air, craning their necks toward a rising plume of dust and smoke. Within minutes, sirens cut through the confusion as police and firefighters converged on the source. A shattered front of a modest row home, its entryway mangled by an explosive device that had been placed just outside the door. As officers pushed onlookers back, word began to filter through the crowd. The man who lived here was not an ordinary South Philadelphia resident. He was widely identified in law enforcement files and local whispers alike as the head of the city's Italian-American crime family, the short-lived successor to the long-dominant Angelo Bruno. By the end of the night, investigators confirmed what the neighborhood already suspected. Philip Charles Testa, known on the street and in headlines as the Chicken Man, was dead. In the days that followed, news of the bombing spread far beyond Philadelphia. Newspapers framed it as another sign that the old rules of organized crime were collapsing. Bruno, the so-called Gentle Don, who had kept the city's underworld relatively quiet for years, had been killed the year before. Now his successor had met a violent end just 11 months into his reign. Commentators spoke of a new era of infighting, of younger and more reckless figures willing to turn residential blocks into crime scenes. Years later, a popular rock song would immortalize the event with a brief, stark reference to a chicken man being blown up in Philadelphia, cementing the moment in the broader American imagination. Yet the life that ended on that South Philadelphia porch did not begin amid headlines and FBI surveillance. To understand how Philip Testa became a symbol of a turbulent era in American organized crime, it is necessary to step away from the wreckage of that night and follow his story back across the Atlantic, to a small Sicilian port town and an immigrant neighborhood shaped by hardship, tight-knit loyalty, and the shadow of the underworld. Philip Charles Testa is recorded as having been born on April 21, 1924, in Castellammare del Golfo, a coastal town in the province of Trapani on the northwestern edge of Sicily. Castellammare del Golfo, like many Sicilian communities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was a place of steep, rocky hills and narrow streets that opened onto the sea. Fishing and small-scale agriculture dominated local life. Work was often precarious and poorly paid, and the rigid social hierarchy of rural Sicily left many families struggling to advance beyond subsistence. For decades, residents of towns like Castellammare del Golfo had been part of a steady current of migration away from the island. From the 1880s onward, economic difficulties, limited prospects, and political unrest pushed hundreds of thousands of Italians, and especially Sicilians, to seek opportunity overseas. The United States, and particularly its industrial cities, offered the promise of wage work and a path, however difficult, to stability. By the time Testa was born, that transatlantic pattern was well established. Extended families might have one branch still in Sicily and another in New York, Philadelphia, or Chicago, with news, money, and expectations flowing between them. Castellammare del Golfo was also, historically, one of several Sicilian localities known to have connections to the early mafia. Long before Testa's birth, the town and its surroundings had produced men who became involved in protection rackets, smuggling, and informal systems of authority that filled gaps left by the Italian state. It would be inaccurate to suggest that every family, or even most residents, were involved in such activities. Most were not. But in places like Castellammare, awareness of such networks and of the unwritten codes that governed them formed part of the social landscape. Children grew up hearing names and stories, even if they did not fully understand their implications. Against that backdrop, the Testa family joined the wider wave of Sicilian migration. The exact year of their departure from Italy does not appear in the surviving public record, but by Philip's youth the family was settled in the United States. Like many Sicilian immigrants of that era, they gravitated toward a neighborhood where people spoke their dialect, worshipped at familiar-style churches, and could rely on relatives or pisani, fellow townspeople, for help in finding work and housing. For the Testas, that destination was South Philadelphia. South Philadelphia in the 1920s and 1930s was a dense, multi-ethnic patchwork of row houses, narrow streets, and corner shops. Italian immigrants and their children clustered in sections around Christian Street, Passyunk Avenue, and the surrounding blocks, sharing the urban landscape with Irish, Jewish, and later African American residents. Life in these enclaves was structured around the parish church, small businesses, mutual aid societies, and extended families living within walking distance of one another. Languages from the old country mingled with English on stoops and in grocery stores. Many adults spoke little English, while their children became bilingual. The young Philip Testa came of age in this world, during years defined by economic crisis and then global war. The Great Depression hit immigrant neighborhoods hard. Jobs on the docks, in factories, and in construction were often scarce and unstable. Families took in boarders, children contributed whatever income they could from odd jobs, and credit from local grocers could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. In such conditions, informal economies flourished. Gambling, unlicensed drinking clubs, and loan offices, outside bank regulations, all offered ways to make or lose money fast. Some were merely marginal or technically illegal. Others were entwined with more serious criminal organizations. Little detailed documentation exists about Testa's earliest school years or specific childhood experiences. Law enforcement files and journalistic profiles compiled much later in his life describe him as having limited formal education and entering the workforce at a young age. That put him in line with many of his peers. In South Philadelphia's Italian districts, it was not uncommon for boys to leave school after the minimum required years, taking up manual labor, market work, or trades through family connections. What can be said with certainty is that by the time Philip reached adolescence, he was part of a community where hard physical work, tight family solidarity, and a wary awareness of street power all coexisted. The underworld presence in South Philadelphia dated back to well before Testa's youth. During the Prohibition era of the 1920s, when the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages were outlawed nationwide, bootlegging became a lucrative enterprise. In Philadelphia, as in other cities, gangs organized around ethnicity and neighborhood to control smuggling routes, speakeasies, and protection rackets. Sicilian and Southern Italian groups were among those who carved out territory. Figures like Salvatore Sabella, believed by federal authorities to be the first formal boss of what would become the Philadelphia Cosa Nostra family, emerged from the same broad migrant stream that had brought the Testas to the city. By the early 1930s, Prohibition had ended, but the organizations built in those years did not disappear. They shifted focus to gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and other ventures. The structure of what the FBI would come to call the Philadelphia, South Jersey La Cosa Nostra family took shape. A boss, underboss, consigliere, and a network of maid, members, and associates, many of them from Sicilian or Southern Italian backgrounds. Information about this organization filtered through South Philadelphia in a limited, often indirect way. Men seen regularly outside certain social clubs, sudden improvements in lifestyle, hushed conversations about who was connected. For a boy or young man growing up in the neighborhood, these clues formed part of the urban landscape, even if no direct contact occurred. Philip Testa's name first appears in surviving law enforcement records years later, in the context of illegal gambling and related offenses. The exact details and dates of those early entries can vary among sources, but by the mid-20th century, local police and later, federal agents were aware of him as a figure associated with the South Philadelphia underworld. He was not, at that point, a headline-making leader but a lesser-known participant in the broad ecosystem of bookmakers, enforcers, and facilitators who made the larger criminal enterprise function. Over time, Testa's reputation in these circles grew. Investigators and organized crime writers would later describe him as a man who kept a low public profile, preferring to avoid unnecessary attention. Physically, he was often characterized as heavyset, with a distinctive pockmarked face. It was this complexion, combined in some accounts with a period of involvement in or around a poultry-related business, that led to the nickname, the Chicken Man. The moniker was not initially a media creation. It circulated in local and criminal circles first and only later found its way into newspapers and, eventually, popular culture. The path that led Testa from neighborhood figure to high-ranking member of the Philadelphia family ran through one man in particular, Angelo Bruno. Born Angelo Annalaro in 1910 in Villalba, Sicily, Bruno had immigrated as a child and, like Testa, settled in South Philadelphia. By the 1950s, he was a significant figure in the city's underworld, known for his preference for discretion, negotiation, and stable arrangements over flamboyant violence. When he became boss of the Philadelphia family around 1959, he ushered in a long period, roughly 2 decades, in which the organization sought steady profits and relatively low public visibility. It was during Bruno's ascent and subsequent reign that Testa moved closer to the top of the organization. The two men shared immigrant Sicilian backgrounds and a base in the same South Philadelphia milieu. Exact details of the early phases of their association, such as the moment they first met or the specific tasks Testa initially handled for Bruno, are not thoroughly documented in accessible public sources. However, by the late 1960s and early 1970s, law enforcement investigations and surveillance made clear that Testa was no longer a peripheral figure. He was identified as one of Bruno's trusted lieutenants, a man who could be relied upon to help maintain control over the family's interests in gambling, loans, and other criminal markets. The environment that shaped Testa in these years was one of contrasts. On the one hand, South Philadelphia was a place of close family ties, traditional religious practices, and everyday struggle that many residents navigated honestly. On the other, certain blocks contained social clubs and back rooms where illegal deals were made and disputes settled according to unwritten codes rather than the official legal system. A young man with roots in both Sicily and this American neighborhood would have been aware of notions of honor, loyalty, and silence, the much-publicized omertà that circulated in stories about the mafia. For most, such ideas remain just that, stories. For those who moved more deeply into the orbit of the organization, they became operating principles. To present Testa's development solely as a product of cultural background would be to oversimplify a more complex reality. Many of his peers, raised in the same streets and circumstances, chose different paths. But the combination of economic limitations, the visibility of illicit opportunity, and the presence of powerful older figures who could offer protection and advancement through illegal work created a set of options that some found difficult to resist. As Testa's involvement grew, so did his exposure to the risks that came with life in organized crime: arrest, imprisonment, and, in extreme cases, deadly reprisals. By the 1960s, American law enforcement agencies were paying more systematic attention to figures like Testa. The establishment of the FBI's Top Hoodlum program, inspired in part by the revelations of the 1957 Appalachian meeting of national mafia leaders in upstate New York, led to increased surveillance of suspected organized crime figures in cities across the country. In Philadelphia, this meant wiretaps, informants, and careful tracking of social networks. Within this emerging mosaic, Philip Testa appeared repeatedly as one of the South Philadelphia men whose movements and associations were worth noting. At the same time, broader changes were reshaping the city and the world around him. Post-war economic growth, suburbanization, and demographic shifts were altering South Philadelphia's composition. Some Italian-American families moved out to newer neighborhoods or nearby towns as they improved their economic standing. Others remained. New populations moved in. Through it all, the entrenched criminal networks adapted, seeking new sources of revenue and new ways to protect themselves from law enforcement scrutiny. In these decades, the gap between Testa's public image and his underworld role remained pronounced. To the general public, his name was largely unknown. Local papers might print occasional stories about gambling raids or indictments listing a roster of defendants, but it was the better-known boss, Angelo Bruno, who drew what attention there was. Inside the organization, however, Testa's standing rose steadily. His quiet reputation, Sicilian roots, and demonstrated loyalty made him useful to a leader like Bruno, who valued stability and trusted circles more than brute intimidation. The transformation from immigrant child to significant underworld figure did not occur overnight. It unfolded gradually against the backdrop of South Philadelphia's row house blocks, church festivals, shifting economies, and simmering tensions. By the time federal racketeering laws and internal disputes began to place unprecedented pressure on the old order, Philip Testa was deeply embedded in a world that had, decades earlier, simply been the neighborhood around him. The blast that would one day claim his life in the early hours of a March morning seemed, in that neighborhood's long history, both a shocking rupture and the culmination of forces that had been at work since the days when families like the Testas first crossed the ocean in search of a better future. By the middle of the 20th century, the streets where Philip Testa had grown up were no longer simply the domain of first-generation strivers and their children. They had become, as far as the FBI and local police were concerned, the heart of a structured criminal organization with ties reaching from Philadelphia to New York and beyond. Angelo Bruno's rise to leadership at the end of the 1950s helped define this new era, and it was in this period that Testa's position within the underworld began to crystallize. When Bruno assumed control of the Philadelphia family around 1959, he did so in a way that contrasted with the more openly violent bosses of previous decades. His reputation as the docile Don, or gentle Don, was not a claim that his organization rejected coercion or serious crime. Rather, it reflected his preference for quiet arrangements, consistent profits, and minimal disruption. He cultivated relationships with other mafia families, particularly in New York, and focused his operations on activities like illegal gambling, loan sharking, and control over certain labor unions and construction markets. This approach reduced the number of public gangland shootings that had, in earlier years, brought police pressure and negative headlines. Within the neighborhoods of South Philadelphia, the effects of this strategy could be seen in the regular hum of unofficial commerce. Numbers games, informal lotteries often known simply as the numbers, thrived in corner stores, bars, and back rooms. Sports betting, card games, and dice games offered chances at quick wins and equally quick losses. For people living paycheck to paycheck, these activities sometimes served as a substitute for conventional banking and entertainment alike. To outside observers, it might have looked like little more than local vice, but behind it were structured hierarchies, routes for collecting payments, and individuals responsible for making sure debts were not ignored. It was in this tiered system that figures like Philip Testa operated. By the early 1960s, his name had begun to appear in city police files associated with gambling operations and related offenses. The surviving public record does not provide a full, day-by-day account of his activities, but law enforcement reports and later court documents agree on several broad points. Testa was not a street-level runner. He occupied a middle rank, overseeing collections, ensuring that bookmakers paid their share upward, and representing the interests of higher-ranking figures in disputes. In the language of the emerging FBI files, he was treated as a key associate of Bruno, and eventually as a caporgine, a captain responsible for a crew of lower-ranking members and associates. At the same time, Testa maintained a relatively low personal profile. He lived in a modest South Philadelphia row house rather than a conspicuous mansion. Neighbors later recalled him as reserved, more likely to be seen quietly visiting local shops or speaking on the sidewalk with acquaintances than putting on a display. He married and had at least one child, his son Salvator, known as Salvi, who would himself become a significant and ultimately tragic figure in the Philadelphia underworld. To many on the block, the elder Testa was simply another family man in a neighborhood full of them, even as his name became better known in law enforcement circles. Meanwhile, the federal government's view of organized crime was undergoing a major transformation. For decades, J. Edgar Hoover had been reluctant to acknowledge the existence of a nationwide mafia. That changed after 1957, when New York State troopers unexpectedly disrupted a gathering of top underworld figures in the small town of Appalachian, New York. Among those detained and identified as attendees was Angelo Bruno. Newspaper coverage of the event and later congressional inquiries forced federal agencies to concede what local police and investigative journalists had long argued, that there was a structured network of Italian-American organized crime families across the country. After Appalachian, more sustained attention turned toward the Philadelphia family. In the early 1960s, the testimony of Joseph Valachi, a New York mobster who became the first publicly acknowledged member of the American Mafia to cooperate with the government, offered national audiences a framework for understanding the organization's rituals, ranks, and rules. Although Valachi's experience was rooted in New York, his descriptions of bosses, underbosses, capos, and soldiers applied just as well to the structure taking shape under Bruno in Philadelphia. Men like Testa now existed not just in the shadows of neighborhood rumor, but in the crosshairs of a more informed and determined federal response. That response took concrete form in increased surveillance. FBI agents followed suspected mob figures, recorded license plates outside social clubs, and attempted to place informants within rings of bookmakers and loan sharks. In some cases, they obtained court approval for wiretaps, which allowed them to listen in on conversations in clubhouses, bars, and homes. It was through such methods that the Bureau deepened its understanding of Bruno's inner circle and the roles played by men like Testa, Nicodemo, Little Nicky, Scarfo, Frank Narducci Sr., Peter Pete Casella, and Antonio Tony Bananas Caponegro. Scarfo, in particular, represented a different temperament from Bruno and Testa. Short in stature but known for a quick and sometimes explosive temper, he had already attracted negative attention by the late 1950s, when a barroom stabbing led to his conviction on manslaughter charges. After his release, Bruno, wary of Scarfo's tendency to draw police scrutiny through open violence, effectively exiled him to Atlantic City. There, Scarfo operated in a smaller, rougher environment on the Jersey Shore, still within the Philadelphia family's sphere but at a distance from Bruno's South Philadelphia base. Nonetheless, the relationships forged in these years, including Scarfo's long association with Testa, would play a decisive role later. While Scarfo ran rackets in Atlantic City, Testa remained anchored in South Philadelphia, where he gradually became one of Bruno's most trusted men. Evidence of this trust appeared in the way law enforcement agencies began to describe him. Internal FBI memoranda and shared intelligence with local police increasingly identified Testa not just as a soldier but as a powerful captain, and eventually as a close advisor. When investigators drew charts of suspected leadership structures, Testa's name appeared near the top, though always beneath Bruno. Bruno's rule, however, was not without challenges. Internally, some ambitious figures chafed at his cautious approach. They believed that he was too willing to cooperate with the dominant New York families, particularly when it came to limiting the use of violence and dividing certain profitable territories. Externally, the economic landscape was shifting. Legalized casino gambling in nearby Atlantic City, approved by New Jersey voters in 1976 and implemented over the following years, created a new, highly lucrative set of opportunities and disputes over who would control which aspects of the business, from construction contracts to union influence and the flow of illegal side betting. Before Atlantic City's casinos reshaped the region, however, gambling in Philadelphia itself remained largely illegal and therefore part of the underworld's core business. Police and prosecutors periodically attempted to disrupt these operations. In raids, they seized betting slips, cash, and ledgers. Court records from the late 1960s and 1970s show that Testa and his associates were not immune from these efforts. He was charged on several occasions in connection with illegal gambling operations and related rackets. Some of these cases ended with charges reduced or dismissed, an outcome not unusual in an era when witnesses were often reluctant to testify and evidence could be difficult to obtain. In at least one instance, however, Testa received a prison sentence, serving time before returning to South Philadelphia and resuming his role. These legal encounters underscored a central tension in his life. On one hand, he strove, like Bruno, to avoid overt confrontation with the state. On the other, his livelihood depended on activities that the law treated as serious offenses. Arrests and convictions, even if not catastrophic, disrupted business and weakened the aura of invulnerability that the organization tried to project. For younger men observing from the sidelines, the pattern set a clear example. Involvement promised money and influence, but carried real risks of incarceration and long-term surveillance. Within the community, the presence of men like Testa produced a complicated mixture of fear, resentment, and in some quarters, a kind of grudging respect. Some small business owners saw them as sources of unwanted pressure, compelled to pay for protection, or to permit illegal betting on the premises. Others believed that the underworld provided a rough form of order, discouraging certain types of street-level crime in areas where it wanted peace. Still others, facing financial hardship, turned to underworld lenders, accepting high interest rates and the possibility of intimidation if they fell behind, because they felt they had no other options. The romanticized image of organized crime that sometimes appeared in later films did not capture the everyday strain and anxiety these arrangements produced. As the 1970s progressed, federal authorities gained new tools to confront organized crime. Chief among them was the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, enacted in 1970. RICO allowed prosecutors to charge individuals not only for specific criminal acts, but for participating in a pattern of racketeering activity within an enterprise. This made it easier to target leaders who might rarely handle illegal goods directly or issue overt threats, but who benefited from and directed ongoing criminal operations. For families like Bruno, RICO represented a significant escalation in the legal threat. Soon, grand juries in Philadelphia and neighboring jurisdictions began issuing indictments that explicitly named the organization as a cohesive enterprise. Testa's name appeared among those charged in some of these cases, usually alongside allegations of overseeing or profiting from illegal gambling and loan sharking. Even when defendants secured acquittals or negotiated plea deals, the cases forced them into courtrooms, consumed time and resources, and generated paper trails that would later assist further investigations. The once shadowy world of the guys from the club was now documented in hundreds of pages of affidavits, transcripts, and exhibits. During these years, Testa's son Salvi came of age. Growing up in a household where his father's ties were no secret, and in a neighborhood where underworld figures had considerable influence, he gravitated toward the same world. By the late 1970s, law enforcement accounts identified Salvi as an active associate deeply involved in the family's affairs. Unlike his father, whose reputation emphasized steadiness and quiet persistence, the younger Testa was seen as more aggressive, eager to prove himself, and admired by some of his peers for his willingness to take risks. The intergenerational continuity embodied in the Testa family, father and son embedded within the same organization, illustrated how deeply rooted the underworld presence had become in certain social circles. Although the public at large remained only dimly aware of Philip Testa's existence, reporters specializing in crime began to notice his recurring appearance in court records and police reports. Articles about gambling raids or RICO indictments occasionally mentioned him as a reputed mob figure or alleged associate of reputed mafia boss Angelo Bruno. The qualified language reflected legal caution. Journalists could not assert membership without risking defamation claims, but the pattern was increasingly clear. Within the closed meeting rooms of police precincts and FBI field offices, there was little doubt about his role. Still, Bruno's preference for restraint kept the Philadelphia family from erupting into the kind of open warfare that periodically plagued other cities. Throughout the 1960s and much of the 1970s, there were comparatively few high-profile underworld killings in Philadelphia compared to earlier decades or to cities like New York and Chicago. When violence did occur, it was carried out in ways that minimized public spectacle, a reflection of Bruno's belief that avoiding headlines was the best way to preserve long-term profits. This approach suited Testa, whose unassuming personal style made it easier for him to navigate both the underworld and the everyday life of his community. Yet beneath the surface, strains were building. Some members resented what they saw as Bruno's overly cozy relationships with outside families, particularly in New York, and his control over lucrative territories. The coming boom in Atlantic City construction and gambling intensified these feelings. Men who had struggled for years in smaller rackets saw a chance at transformational profits and resented any plan that appeared to limit their share. Disagreements about who would be allowed to invest in or skim from casino-related ventures, and on what terms, sowed distrust within the leadership. It was in this atmosphere of simmering discontent and growing law enforcement pressure that Testa's role as a stabilizing figure became more important. Law enforcement sources from the period describe him as someone Bruno relied upon to help manage disputes at the local level, ensuring that bookmakers paid what they owed, that loans were collected without drawing unnecessary attention, and that younger associates did not engage in reckless acts that would bring police down on entire crews. He also maintained ties with Scarfo in Atlantic City, giving him a vantage point on evolving opportunities and rivalries along the Jersey Shore. The quieter side of Testa's life continued in parallel. He was seen attending church services, stopping by local bakeries and butcher shops, and participating in extended family gatherings typical of the neighborhood's Italian-American households. These ordinary scenes stood in stark contrast to the content of the surveillance reports that followed his movements, listing meetings with other suspected mob figures, late-night gatherings in social clubs, and unexplained sources of cash. The juxtaposition highlighted a central paradox of his existence. He was at once a familiar neighbor and a man whose everyday decisions affected the distribution of illegal wealth and the well-being of those drawn into his orbit. By the late 1970s, as prosecutors filed more ambitious RICO cases and Atlantic City casinos began to transform the regional economy, the balance that had defined Bruno's long reign grew increasingly fragile. Old understandings about who controlled which markets were questioned. Younger men, emboldened by potential profits and less intimidated by the idea of challenging established leaders, began to test boundaries. The National Mafia Commission in New York, which had long served as an informal arbiter among families, faced its own internal pressures and shifting priorities. In Philadelphia, all of these changes converged on the network that centered around Angelo Bruno and his senior lieutenants, including Philip Testa. The same qualities that had once been strengths, caution, a preference for negotiation over overt displays of force, steady but unremarkable flows of money, now struck some as signs of missed opportunities or weakness. Law enforcement, for its part, interpreted the ongoing relative calm as further evidence that Bruno's low-key strategy was effective, and that, if his top associates could be successfully prosecuted, the entire organization might be destabilized. On the streets of South Philadelphia, life went on much as it had for decades. Children played on sidewalks under the watch of grandparents on stoops. Parish festivals filled blocks with music and food. Shopkeepers opened early and closed late. Yet within the back rooms of certain bars and the upstairs of certain clubhouses, conversations unfolded about loyalties, revenues, and the future direction of the family. Men like Testa, who had spent their adult lives navigating these currents, understood that shifts at the top could quickly ripple downward, changing alliances and exposing them to new dangers. As the new decade approached, the gap between the stable facade and the tensions beneath it widened. The long-standing boss, nearing the end of his life, faced unprecedented internal dissent. Younger and more volatile figures in and around the family weighed their options. Federal agents compiled thicker and thicker files on everyone in Bruno's circle, including the quiet, heavy-set man from Castellamare del Golfo, whose path from immigrant child to powerful underworld figure had been shaped by the very forces, migration, economic hardship, and the lure of illicit opportunity that had defined South Philadelphia for half a century. The calm that still prevailed on most days would not last much longer. On a chilly evening in late March 1980, the careful balance that had defined Angelo Bruno's long rule came to an abrupt and irreversible end. After decades of avoiding the kind of spectacular violence that drew national attention, the Philadelphia family crossed a line that would change its trajectory, and with it, the fate of men like Philip Testa. Bruno spent that March 21 as he had spent countless other days, moving between familiar locations in South Philadelphia and Center City, quietly attending to business. He was 69 years old, still officially the boss of the Philadelphia, South Jersey organization, and under federal indictment in a racketeering case that alleged he and several associates controlled lucrative gambling and loan sharking operations. The indictment was serious, but Bruno had faced legal trouble before and maintained his usual outward calm. To observers that day, nothing suggested a turning point was at hand. Shortly before 10 p.m., Bruno returned to his modest brick row home on Snyder Avenue in South Philadelphia. He rode in the front passenger seat of his car, driven by an associate who would later become a central, if contested, figure in the story. John Stanfa, a younger man of Sicilian origin who worked as a driver and aide and would, years later, emerge in his own right as a leader in the Philadelphia underworld. When the car pulled up in front of the house, Bruno remained seated as he often did, gathering his effects and preparing to step out. What happened next unfolded in seconds. A man approached the vehicle and fired a shotgun through the car window, striking Bruno and killing him in the front seat of his own automobile, outside his own home. The driver was left unharmed. Neighbors who heard the blast called authorities. Police and medical personnel converged on the scene, and by the early hours of the morning, television and radio stations across the region were reporting that the long-standing, gentle Don of Philadelphia had been assassinated. The killing sent shockwaves through law enforcement, the underworld, and the wider city. For years, Bruno's ability to keep overt violence to a minimum had led some to describe his regime as almost stable compared to the volatile histories of other cities. Now that image collapsed in an instant. Investigators knew that such a bold attack on a sitting boss could only have come from someone inside or closely connected to the organization. The question on everyone's mind was who had authorized and carried out the hit, and what it meant for the future of the family. In the weeks and months that followed, a picture slowly emerged, pieced together from informant reports, surveillance, and later testimony. At the center of the suspected plot stood Antonio "Tony Bananas" Caponigro, a longtime Bruno associate who served as the family's consigliere. Caponigro had grown increasingly dissatisfied with Bruno's leadership, particularly his restrictions on large-scale drug trafficking and his insistence that certain profits from operations in North Jersey flow to the powerful Genovese family in New York, which claimed territorial rights there. To ambitious men like Caponigro, these arrangements looked less like prudent diplomacy and more like missed opportunities and unnecessary tribute. According to law enforcement assessments, Caponigro and a small circle of allies believed that eliminating Bruno would allow them to seize control of the Philadelphia family and redirect its activities according to their own priorities. In the traditional structure of the American mafia, however, killing a sitting boss was not a step to be taken lightly. Such actions were expected to be cleared in advance by the National Mafia Commission, a loose governing body dominated by New York's 5 families. Defying that expectation could bring severe consequences, as leaders who valued order feared the destabilizing effects of unauthorized coups. Caponigro later appears in investigative reconstructions as a man who believed he had some form of approval, or who at least claimed, after the fact, that he had been led to believe his plan was acceptable. Some accounts suggest he may have received ambiguous or misleading signals from contacts in New York. Others portray him as overconfident, assuming he could present a fait accompli that the commission would be forced to accept. Whatever the precise mix of misunderstanding and calculation, the outcome was clear. Bruno was dead, and the commission's reaction, once it fully grasped the situation, was not favorable. While these high-level assessments unfolded, the immediate aftermath in Philadelphia was confusion and fear. Cosa Nostra families traditionally prized continuity. When one boss died, another usually stepped in swiftly, often someone already occupying a high rank such as underboss or consigliere. But Bruno's murder was not a natural passing. It was a deliberate internal strike. That fact made the question of succession more fraught. Any man who stepped forward too aggressively risked being seen by both law enforcement and rival factions as implicated in the plot. At this critical juncture, Philip Testa's long-standing role as Bruno's loyal deputy came into sharper focus. For years, he had acted as a key subordinate, generally described in law enforcement documents as an underboss or high-ranking captain. He had not been linked by investigators or informants to the conspiracy against Bruno. On the contrary, his established closeness to the dead boss made it plausible that he had been sidelined or opposed by the plotters. In a world where personal ties and perceived loyalties carried as much weight as formal titles, that distinction mattered. In the weeks after the assassination, funeral arrangements and private meetings unfolded against a backdrop of heavy police and FBI surveillance. Bruno's funeral mass, held at a Catholic church in South Philadelphia, drew a mix of relatives, friends, and men whom authorities identified as organized crime figures from across the region and beyond. Outside, cameras recorded license plates and faces. Inside, whispered conversations touched on the same question that preoccupied investigators: who would lead now? The answer did not become fully clear until events far from Philadelphia sent their own message. A month after Bruno's death, in April 1980, New York authorities discovered the body of Antonio Caponigro in the Bronx, brutally killed and left in the trunk of a car. Days later, his brother-in-law and ally, Alfredo "Freddie" Easy, met a similar fate in New Jersey. The Pennsylvania Crime Commission and other investigative bodies later concluded that these killings were carried out with the knowledge and approval of New York leadership as punishment for organizing the unauthorized murder of Bruno. In the coded world of mafia politics, the message was unmistakable. The commission would not tolerate unilateral upheaval. With Caponigro dead and his inner circle disrupted, the path cleared for a different kind of successor, one whose close connection to Bruno and reputation for steadiness reassured older leaders. That man was Philip Testa. By late 1980, law enforcement agencies and later court testimony converged on the view that the commission had effectively recognized Testa as the new boss of the Philadelphia family, elevating him from his previous role as a top lieutenant. The arrangement was not publicly announced, of course, but it became evident in the way associates approached him and in the structure of the crews beneath him. Testa's promotion marked the culmination of a long, incremental ascent that began decades earlier in the narrow streets of South Philadelphia. It also placed him at the head of an organization in turmoil. He inherited not the relatively placid regime that Bruno had built, but a shaken, divided family facing intense outside pressure. Federal prosecutors were pursuing major racketeering cases. Internal factions that had backed Caponigro or hoped to profit from Bruno's removal were not simply going to disappear. And the economic environment was shifting, with Atlantic City's legalized casinos expanding rapidly and drawing attention from every family within reach. Within his first months as boss, Testa moved to fill key positions around him, forming an inner circle that reflected both his long-standing relationships and the difficult balancing act he faced. Contemporary law enforcement charts and later testimony identified Peter "Pete" Casella as his underboss, a man with his own base of support and ambitions. Nicodemo, Little Nicky Scarfo, the previously semi-exiled Atlantic City figure whose ruthless reputation had made Bruno wary, reemerged from his Jersey Shore stronghold as an increasingly influential advisor. Many sources indicate that Scarfo became the family's consigliere under Testa, giving him a formal role in counseling the boss and mediating disputes. Scarfo's return to prominence was significant. Under Bruno, his assignment to Atlantic City had kept him somewhat at the margins of the Philadelphia power structure, even as he cultivated deep ties within that burgeoning gambling hub. Under Testa, Scarfo's position strengthened. The two men had known each other for years and shared roots in the old South Philadelphia network. Scarfo's methods, far more openly intimidating than Bruno, were controversial even within the underworld, but to some in the unsettled post-Bruno era, they seemed useful. A family that had just weathered the assassination of its boss and the execution of the conspirators needed someone perceived as capable of enforcing discipline. At the same time, Testa's son, Salvi, advanced rapidly. Young, energetic, and reputedly fearless, he was viewed by law enforcement and underworld observers alike as a rising star. His closeness to both his father and Scarfo, who took a strong interest in him, made him a pivotal player in the new order. To older men loyal to the Bruno style, this concentration of power in the hands of the Testa family and the volatile Scarfo raised questions about the long-term direction of the organization. Outside the family, the broader climate in Philadelphia and neighboring New Jersey was one of unease and change. The city was grappling with deindustrialization, rising unemployment, and fiscal strain. Manufacturing jobs that had sustained working-class neighborhoods for generations were disappearing. Many residents struggled with economic insecurity, and certain areas saw increases in street crime and the spread of addictive drugs, particularly heroin. These conditions created both opportunities and complications for organized crime groups. On one hand, economic distress increased the pool of people vulnerable to high-interest loans from underworld lenders and attracted new customers to illegal gambling as they chased unlikely financial windfalls. On the other, the proliferation of independent drug dealers and loosely organized street gangs introduced new, often unpredictable players into markets that the traditional mafia considered its domain. Testa inherited the challenge of maintaining his family's influence in this changing landscape, without provoking the kind of open warfare that would bring a crushing legal response. Federal and state authorities, for their part, intensified their efforts. The Justice Department, encouraged by the relatively new RICO statute, pursued broad, conspiracy-based cases against entire networks rather than piecemeal prosecutions of individual gambling or extortion incidents. In Philadelphia, U.S. attorneys and the Pennsylvania Crime Commission treated the aftermath of Bruno's death as an opportunity to press harder, arguing that the public violence showed the danger posed by the organization. FBI field offices expanded their use of electronic surveillance, seeking warrants to bug social clubs and pay phones frequented by suspected mob figures. Within this pressure-filled environment, Testa tried to project an image of continuity and control. His public life remained understated. He continued living in his row house on Porter Street, only a short distance from the house where Bruno had been killed. He visited local shops and greeted neighbors much as he had before, giving the impression that life, at least on the surface, went on as usual. Those around him understood, however, that these were no longer the years of quiet deference to a single, uncontested boss. Every visit to a club, every extended meeting, and every sudden change in routine now attracted the interest of both subordinates and surveillance teams. The organization's internal dynamics were equally tense. Caponigro's removal and Testa's elevation did not magically resolve long-standing grievances. Some men felt that Testa represented the old guard, too closely tied to the cautious policies of the Bruno era. Others worried that his alliance with Scarfo signaled a shift toward more open reliance on intimidation and violent enforcement. Still others, particularly those who had quietly backed Caponigro or hoped to profit from expanded drug trafficking, feared that Testa might move against them to solidify his control. Law enforcement agencies, reviewing informant reports and intercepted conversations from this period, later described Testa as a man walking a narrow line between these competing pressures. On one side, he had to demonstrate enough strength to deter challenges and reassure higher-ups in New York that he could keep order. On the other, he had to avoid the kind of dramatic, high-profile outbreaks of violence that would justify large-scale crackdowns and RICO indictments centered on specific homicides. His efforts to strike this balance would define much of his short tenure as boss. Meanwhile, the formal court cases that had occupied Bruno before his death continued to cast a shadow. Some of the same investigations now touched Testa directly. He was named in federal indictments that accused him and his associates of overseeing gambling and loan-sharking rings stretching from Philadelphia into neighboring counties and parts of New Jersey. While the charges did not carry the same drama as a murder prosecution, they were serious and, if successful, threatened to remove him and several key lieutenants from the streets for years. For the communities in which these events unfolded, the experience was complex. Many South Philadelphia residents carried on their daily lives, working, raising families, attending church, aware that their neighborhood contained figures deeply involved in organized crime. Some preferred not to know details, adopting a stance of deliberate distance. As long as trouble did not come to their doorsteps, they did not ask questions. Others, particularly those drawn into illegal betting or who borrowed from underworld lenders, experienced the costs more directly in the form of mounting debts and the ever-present possibility of coercion if they fell behind. Journalists based in Philadelphia and New Jersey began devoting more sustained coverage to the city's underworld during this period. Building on earlier reporting about Bruno and the Appalachian revelations, they followed court cases, developed confidential sources in law enforcement, and mapped out the internal changes after Bruno's assassination. Articles in local newspapers described Testa as the new, reputed head of the Philadelphia family, often mentioning his distinctive nickname and appearance. These reports remained cautious and heavily qualified, but they signaled a growing public awareness of his position. Testa himself did not seek, and likely did not welcome, this attention. Historically, he had preferred the role of trusted second rather than the spotlight of top leadership. Now, however, he was at the center of a story that extended from South Philadelphia row houses to New York boardrooms and federal courtrooms. Every decision he made, about promotions, territory, responses to challenges, could have reverberations that affected not just his own safety, but the future of the entire organization. Against this backdrop, the seeds of the next crisis were quietly being planted. Ambition and resentment did not disappear with Caponigro's death. They shifted targets. Some in Testa's own inner circle began to calculate how they might benefit from another change at the top. The very structure that placed men like Testa and Scarfo near the center of power also positioned them, and their allies, to imagine alternative arrangements that did not include Testa. Federal investigators watching from the outside noted growing friction, but could not yet see how quickly it would escalate. From a distance, the period between Bruno's assassination in March 1980 and the early months of 1981 might look like a brief interlude, a pause between one dramatic killing and another. For those living through it, including Philip Testa, it was a time of intense maneuvering, legal peril, and constant uncertainty. The immigrant boy from Castellamare del Golfo who had once walked South Philadelphia streets as an anonymous youth now found himself at the center of a contest for power whose stakes were life and death, liberty and imprisonment, stability and chaos. The calm that had already started to erode with Bruno's murder was about to shatter completely. By the end of 1980, the man who had once moved quietly through South Philadelphia as a trusted lieutenant found himself at the center of a storm. Philip Charles Testa now carried the weighty, dangerous title of boss, and the position brought none of the security its name might suggest. His elevation after the murder of Angelo Bruno had been intended, in part, as a stabilizing measure. To outside observers, especially in New York, he represented continuity with the old order, Sicilian-born, long loyal to Bruno, and known more for caution than for spectacle. But inside the Philadelphia family, the very factors that made him acceptable to the National Commission also planted the seeds of resentment and intrigue. Testa's leadership began in the shadow of two events: the assassination of Bruno and the retaliatory killing of Antonio "Tony Bananas" Caponigro, whom investigators widely believed had masterminded the plot. The message from New York had been stern. The unauthorized murder of a sitting boss was a violation of long-standing underworld protocol, and those responsible had paid with their lives. In choosing Testa as Bruno's successor, commission leaders signaled that they wanted order restored. At the same time, they turned a wary eye toward Philadelphia, expecting its new boss to reassert control and prevent further instability. To meet that expectation, Testa drew his inner circle from familiar ranks. He leaned on men he had known for years, men whose loyalties, he believed, had been tested through previous upheavals and investigations. Pete Casella was named underboss, a choice that reflected both his seniority and his own following in South Philadelphia. Nicodemo "Little Nicky" Scarfo, long relegated to Atlantic City as a way of keeping his volatile nature at a safe distance, became consigliere. It was a striking change in Scarfo's fortunes. From semi-exile, he was now formally recognized as one of the top 3 figures in the family. This triumvirate was never an entirely comfortable fit. Testa, nearing his late 50s, carried the habits of the Bruno era, understated, steady, inclined toward quiet business and limited confrontation. Casella possessed his own ambitions and contacts, especially among men who had grown restless under Bruno's carefully managed regime. Scarfo brought a different kind of energy, a readiness to use intimidation and lethal force that many found unnerving, but that some considered necessary in a period when challenges seemed to come from all sides. Holding these tensions together would have been difficult for any leader. For Testa, who had only just transitioned from second-in-command to boss, it was a formidable task. Outside the family, the landscape was equally turbulent. The late 1970s and early 1980s were years of economic strain in Philadelphia. Factories closed or downsized, unemployment climbed, and longtime residents watched as secure blue-collar jobs disappeared. In this environment, organized crime groups intensified their focus on industries that still involved large flows of money: construction, waste hauling, and the building trades. Unions representing workers in these sectors became key targets for influence and control. Through them, underworld figures could extract steady income in the form of kickbacks, no-show jobs, and leverage over contractors. One of the most important of these unions in Philadelphia was Roofers Local 3030B. For years, Local 30 had been a significant presence in the city's construction business, representing workers whose labor was essential to new buildings and major renovations. Its leader in the 1970s, John McCullough, was a tough, long-serving union boss with a reputation for independence and his own history of brushes with the law. Law enforcement reports and later court cases painted a picture of a complex relationship between McCullough and the Bruno organization, sometimes cooperative, sometimes tense, with each side aware that the other had the capacity to disrupt projects and profits. Under Bruno, the relationship had remained uneasy but manageable. With Testa now in charge and Scarfo growing more influential, the stakes rose. Control of the roofers' union meant influence over contracts not just in Philadelphia, but also in the rapidly developing Atlantic City market, where new casinos and hotels required extensive construction. Testa and his lieutenants understood that whoever held real sway over Local 30 could shape and profit from multi-million-dollar projects. Federal authorities recognized the same reality and moved aggressively. In late 1979 and 1980, after long-running investigations that combined surveillance, informants, and financial analysis, prosecutors brought a major case targeting alleged corruption in Local 30. The indictment charged that union officials and organized crime figures had conspired to extort contractors, rig bids, and divert union funds. Among those named were McCullough and several underworld figures, including Philip Testa. The charges drew on the relatively new RICO statute, accusing the defendants not just of isolated acts, but of participating in an ongoing criminal enterprise. For Testa, the indictment was a serious blow. It put him, newly elevated to boss, at the center of a high-profile federal case that threatened a lengthy prison sentence if he were convicted. He was released on bail pending trial, but the looming court date cast a long shadow over his short tenure as leader. Within the family, some saw the charges as an occupational hazard, an inevitable consequence of decades of involvement in illegal gambling and labor racketeering. Others, especially those who had not been swept up in the case, worried that the boss's legal troubles might weaken his position or prompt him to make decisions under pressure that would not favor them. While the case moved slowly toward trial, violence touched the world around it. On November 13, 1980, John McCullough was shot and killed at his home in northeast Philadelphia by a young gunman posing as a deliveryman. The murder shocked the labor community and immediately drew suspicion toward organized crime, given McCullough's role at the center of the contested roofers' union. At the time, investigators struggled to assemble a complete picture. Years later, testimony in federal court and findings by investigative bodies would link the killing to a plot involving Nicodemo Scarfo and his associates, carried out to strengthen the Philadelphia family's control over the union and send a warning to those who resisted their influence. Whether or not Testa personally authorized or even fully understood the details of the McCullough plot remains less clearly documented than Scarfo's later proven involvement. What is evident from the historical record is that, during his brief time as boss, acts of violence associated with his organization became more frequent than during Bruno's final years. Some of these acts were aimed at consolidating control over labor unions. Others reflected efforts to settle internal debts and disputes. Each killing, even when carried out away from public view, risked provoking further scrutiny from law enforcement and inviting retaliation within the underworld. Inside the family, the shifting balance of power around Testa generated its own undercurrents. As consigliere, Scarfo saw his influence increase significantly. He spent more time in South Philadelphia while maintaining his strong base in Atlantic City, where casinos and related businesses were rapidly expanding. To some, he appeared to be the architect of a new, more confrontational strategy. To others, especially those close to Testa, he was still viewed as the same unpredictable figure Bruno had once exiled, now operating under the protective umbrella of a more trusted boss. Underboss Pete Casella occupied a particularly delicate position in this triangle. Formally, he was second in command, the man who would traditionally be seen as next in line for succession. Practically, he had to contend with Scarfo's growing clout and Testa's obvious trust in both his consigliere and his son, Salvi. Law enforcement accounts and later testimony from insiders suggest that Casella came to feel increasingly marginalized. He had support among a faction of South Philadelphia mobsters who believed they had been overlooked or shortchanged under both Bruno and Testa. For them, the concentration of power in the hands of the Testa family and Scarfo's crew was unsettling. At the same time, the younger Testa's rapid rise changed internal dynamics. Salvi was widely regarded in underworld circles as ambitious, assertive, and loyal to his father and Scarfo. He oversaw his own crew, and according to investigators, handled enforcement tasks and money collections with little hesitation. His prominence at a relatively young age stood in contrast to the slower, more incremental paths taken by many older men now subordinate to him. Resentment toward Salvi could easily bleed into resentment toward his father, who was seen as advancing his son's interests within the organization. These personal tensions intersected with anxieties about the legal threat posed by the roofers' union case. As the 1980s opened, the RICO prosecutions targeting organized crime were still a relatively new phenomenon, and their full implications were just beginning to be understood. Some underworld figures believed that if a boss faced serious federal charges, he might consider cooperating with authorities to reduce his sentence, even though such a step would have been considered an extreme betrayal of underworld codes. Others, perhaps more realistically, feared that a convicted boss would be unable to protect his loyalists, leaving them exposed to demotion or reprisal under a new regime. Within this volatile mix of ambition, suspicion, and legal pressure, conversations took place that would, in hindsight, appear fateful. According to later findings by the Pennsylvania Crime Commission and accounts from cooperating witnesses, a faction within the family began to discuss the possibility of removing Testa and reshaping the leadership in their favor. At the center of this faction stood underboss Pete Casella and Frank Narducci SR, a powerful South Philadelphia capo. They and their allies calculated that, if Testa were killed, they could present the act to New York leadership as a necessary correction, perhaps even as a preemptive move to prevent the Philadelphia family from being dragged down by a boss entangled in a major federal case. The precise sequence of those internal conversations is difficult to reconstruct in full. Much of what is known comes from retrospective testimony, informant reports, and investigative inferences rather than contemporaneous records. Still, the broad outline is consistent across sources. Casella and Narducci, seeing their influence threatened by the growing Testa, Scarfo axis, and the spotlight of federal charges, decided to take a drastic step. They needed a method that would eliminate the boss, but also send a message of intimidation to his close allies. The man they settled on to carry out the plot, according to Pennsylvania Crime Commission reports, was a younger associate named Rocco Marinucci. Marinucci moved in South Philadelphia circles and was familiar with the rhythms of the neighborhood. The plan, investigators later concluded, involved planting an explosive device at Testa's home, timed or triggered to go off when he stepped onto his porch. By targeting him at his residence, the plotters were making a statement that no place, even the seemingly safe confines of a family home, was beyond reach. In early 1981, while the roofers' union case inched forward through preliminary motions and court scheduling, Testa continued to move between his roles as boss, father, and neighbor. He attended meetings at social clubs, met with associates in coffee shops and restaurants, and spent time with his family at the familiar row house on Porter Street that now doubled as the home of a crime family leader. Surveillance reports from this period show no sign that he suspected an attack from within his own inner circle, though he lived, as all bosses did, with a general awareness of the risks that came with his position. The timing of what happened next would later attract grim attention. In mid-March 1981, just as jury selection for the roofers' case was beginning and legal pressure on Testa was reaching a peak, the plotters moved to act. Investigators reconstructed the basic events from physical evidence and subsequent witness statements. Under cover of darkness, an explosive device packed with nails was placed near the entrance of Testa's home. Accounts differ on whether it sat on the porch or near the steps, and prepared for remote or timed detonation. In the early hours of March 15, 1981, as much of the city slept, Testa returned to his house. It was just after 1 a.m, a quiet hour in a neighborhood accustomed to late nights but now mostly still. When he stepped toward his front door, the device detonated. The blast tore through the front of the row house, shattered nearby windows, and echoed along the block. Startled neighbors woke to the sound and, within moments, began emerging from their own homes, peering through smoke and dust toward the source of the explosion. Emergency calls brought police and firefighters to the scene. They found the front of the house damaged and debris scattered across the small front yard and sidewalk. Nearby residents, some still in night clothes, stood clustered on the street, shocked into silence or murmuring to one another. The victim was quickly identified as the man who lived there, Philip, the Chicken Man Testa, widely acknowledged in law enforcement circles and in neighborhood whispers as the current head of the Philadelphia, South Jersey crime family. He had been killed almost instantly by the blast. News of the bombing traveled quickly. By morning, local radio and television reports were describing the attack on a reputed organized crime leader at his South Philadelphia home. For many in the city, it was an unsettling echo of Angelo Bruno's assassination just 1 year earlier. That killing had taken place in a car on Snyder Avenue. This one had ripped open the front of a house on Porter Street. Both underscored how internal underworld disputes could erupt into violence on otherwise quiet residential blocks. For law enforcement, Testa's murder confirmed what many had feared since Bruno's death. The Philadelphia family was in a state of profound instability. Within a year, 2 successive bosses had been killed in bold attacks in the heart of South Philadelphia. This was not the controlled, behind-the-scenes enforcement the organization preferred to keep hidden. It was overt warfare, with a reach that now extended to the homes of top leaders. Investigators immediately suspected an inside job, reasoning that no one outside the family would risk such an act without expecting severe retaliation. As detectives combed the scene and federal agents compared notes, attention turned to those with the most to gain, or the most to lose, from Testa's removal. Underboss Pete Casella and Capo Frank Narducci quickly appeared on law enforcement radar screens as potential beneficiaries. They had occupied prominent positions under Testa, and their exemption from harm in the attack raised eyebrows. At the same time, those close to Scarfo and the younger Testa were seen as the most likely to seek revenge, given their reliance on the elder Testa's protection and patronage. Within the underworld, the shock of Testa's death mingled with a grim sense of déjà vu. Men who had only recently adjusted to the loss of Bruno now faced another abrupt realignment. Allegiances had to be reconsidered. Conversations once held in private corners had to be reassessed in light of suddenly changed circumstances. Meanwhile, the National Commission, having punished Caponegro harshly for Bruno's unauthorized killing, now had to evaluate a second Philadelphia assassination. Did the plotters have approval this time? If not, would similar retribution follow? Testa's funeral underscored both the continuity and the fragility of the world he had inhabited. Once again, mourners gathered at a South Philadelphia church, and once again, investigators cataloged those who came to pay their respects. Among the pallbearers was his son, Salvi, whose grief at the loss of his father combined with anger at the betrayal he believed had come from within their own ranks. Nearby stood Nicodemo Scarfo, the consigliere whose star had risen under Testa, and who now, within months, would himself be recognized by law enforcement agencies as the new boss of the Philadelphia family. For the broader public, the bombing left a more abstract but no less unsettling impression. Many residents of South Philadelphia had long known that their neighborhood contained men involved in organized crime. Yet the notion that a dispute among such men could result in an explosion on a residential street deepened anxieties about safety and the reach of underworld conflicts. Commentators in local media drew connections between economic distress, the rise of Atlantic City's gambling economy, and the intensifying struggle to control illegal and semi-legal markets. The Chicken Man bombing, as it came to be known in headlines, seemed less like an isolated act than a symptom of a wider breakdown in the old mechanisms of underworld restraint. In Washington and Harrisburg, officials seized on the event as further justification for robust anti-racketeering efforts. Congressional hearings on organized crime highlighted the Philadelphia killings as evidence that even families once considered relatively orderly could become dangerously unstable. The Pennsylvania Crime Commission, already deeply engaged in studying the state's underworld, devoted significant attention to reconstructing the events leading up to Testa's murder. Its reports would later identify Casella, Narducci, and Marinucci as central figures in the plot, and describe Testa's death as the climax of a power struggle within a family under siege from both internal dissent and external legal pressure. For Philip Charles Testa, the immigrant boy from Castellamare del Golfo who had risen, through decades of quiet but determined involvement in South Philadelphia's underworld, to the position of boss, the story ended in those early morning hours on Porter Street. His life had traced the arc of a particular American experience: arrival in a working-class immigrant neighborhood, exposure to limited economic options, and a pervasive underworld presence, gradual deepening of involvement in illegal enterprises, and eventual entanglement in the legal and lethal consequences that came with high-ranking status in organized crime. His death, like his rise, was shaped by the interplay of personal choices, structural forces, and the shifting dynamics of a city and a criminal organization in transition. In the years that followed, his name would remain part of Philadelphia's crime history, invoked in courtrooms, investigative reports, and more fleetingly in popular culture. But in the immediate aftermath of the bombing, attention focused less on his legacy than on the question that had already haunted Philadelphia once before: who would step into the void at the top of a battered, divided, and increasingly exposed organization? And what would that choice mean for the city, and for everyone who had lived in the long shadow cast by the world in which Philip Testa had risen and fallen? When the dust settled on Porter Street in the early hours of March 15, 1981, the shock within Philadelphia's underworld was immediate but not paralyzing. The organization around Philip Testa had lived for years with the knowledge that power could change hands violently. Within hours of the bombing, men who had depended on him for guidance and protection were calculating what his death meant for them, and who would control the city's criminal rackets next. For law enforcement, the pattern was chillingly clear. Angelo Bruno had been shot to death in March 1980. Now, just shy of a year later, his successor had been killed by an explosive device at his own front door. The Philadelphia family, once regarded as comparatively disciplined, looked more like a house with its roof torn off, exposed to the elements and to its own internal storms. Federal and local investigators converged on the scene, comparing forensic traces from the bombing with their ever-growing files on the organization. The investigation moved quickly, driven by the urgency of the circumstances and the amount of attention the case received. Witnesses spoke of a quiet block jolted awake. Neighbors recalled seeing an unfamiliar car, an unknown figure near the house, small details that took on new significance in hindsight. Physical evidence suggested that the device had been packed with nails, consistent with an intent to maximize damage, though authorities avoided sensational descriptions in public updates. The method itself, an explosive at a residence, reinforced the view that this was not a message from a rival ethnic gang or external criminal group. It carried the marks of an inside job by people who knew Testa's routines and were willing to violate traditional underworld cautions about keeping violence away from family homes. Within days, the name of Rocco Marinucci surfaced in confidential law enforcement discussions. Marinucci was a young South Philadelphia associate with connections to underboss Peter, Pete, Casella, and capo Frank Narducci SR. Informants indicated that he had been boasting, in limited and reckless ways, about some role in a big piece of work. Investigators could not immediately prove his involvement, but the combination of street talk and his known ties to Casella's faction made him a person of interest. Inside the family, the suspicion was even more pointed. Those closest to Testa, especially his sons Salvi and consigliere Nicodemo, Little Nicky Scarfo, were convinced that the plot had originated within their own leadership ranks. To them, the idea that an outside group would risk the inevitable blowback of killing a sitting boss so soon after the turmoil around Bruno's death made little sense. They focused their anger on the men who had stood just below Testa in the hierarchy. In this charged atmosphere, swift retaliation functioned as both personal vengeance and a political statement. On March 18, just 3 days after the bombing, Marinucci was lured to a candy shop in South Philadelphia. There, he was ambushed and shot multiple times, dying on the street. Police arrived to find another body tied to the city's underworld disputes, though no one was immediately charged. Investigative reports and later testimony by former mob figures would attribute the killing to Scarfo's camp, framing it as payback for Marinucci's role in the Testa plot. The speed of Marinucci's death sent a clear signal. Whoever had backed the bombing was not beyond reach. It also confirmed, in the eyes of law enforcement, that the explosion on Porter Street was indeed an internally orchestrated act. An unrelated enemy would not have faced such immediate, targeted retaliation. Investigators increasingly looked toward the inner circle of the late boss, especially underboss Casella and capo Narducci, to understand how and why the decision to remove Testa had been made. At the same time, another critical development was unfolding. With Testa gone, someone had to take control of the Philadelphia family. Once again, attention within the mafia world turned to New York's commission. Only a year earlier, the commission had punished Antonio, Tony Bananas, Caponegro for organizing Bruno's unsanctioned murder, approving his execution and that of his close ally. The message had been that unauthorized action against a sitting boss would not be tolerated. Now, the leadership in New York had to decide who would head a family that had seen 2 bosses killed in as many years. In this context, Nicodemo Scarfo was an obvious, if controversial, candidate. He had been consigliere under Testa. He had long-standing connections in both South Philadelphia and Atlantic City, and he had already demonstrated a willingness to use force decisively. To some commission members, Scarfo's hard-line reputation may have seemed like exactly what was required to reassert discipline over a fractious organization. Others were wary of his volatility. But with Testa tainted by suspicion and Testa's own bloodline, represented only by the still relatively young and untested Salvi, Scarfo emerged as the man New York could recognize as boss. By late 1981, law enforcement agencies began to describe Scarfo in internal memoranda and surveillance summaries as the new head of the Philadelphia, South Jersey family. There was no public inauguration, no ceremony. The confirmation came through patterns of deference, observed meetings, and the accounts of informants who described Scarfo giving orders and settling disputes that Testa would once have handled. For the first time in its history, the family would be led by a man whose reputation was built less on quiet deal-making and more on overt intimidation. One of Scarfo's first priorities was to deal with those within the family who had, he believed, conspired against Testa. The killing of Marinucci was only the beginning. Although underboss Peter Testa was not physically attacked, he did not escape consequences. According to later findings by the Pennsylvania Crime Commission, the commission in New York, informed of Testa's suspected involvement in the Testa plot, refused to sanction his continued presence as a leader in Philadelphia. Instead, they effectively ordered him into exile. Testa relocated to Florida, living out his remaining years away from his old South Philadelphia power base, stripped of real authority within the organization he had once hoped to dominate. Frank Narducci S.A. faced a harsher fate. On January 7, 1982, he was shot and killed outside his home in South Philadelphia. The murder bore the hallmarks of a targeted mob hit, carried out swiftly and in a residential setting much like the earlier killings that had defined this bloody period. Years later, cooperating witnesses and investigative bodies would link his death directly to Scarfo's efforts to avenge Testa and consolidate his own dominance. With Narducci dead and Testa in exile, Scarfo had effectively broken the faction believed to be behind the March 1981 bombing. The rapid succession of these events, Bruno's assassination, Testa's bombing, Marinucci's killing, Testa's banishment, Narducci's murder, left even seasoned observers stunned. In less than 2 years, the Philadelphia family had cycled through 2 bosses and expelled or eliminated several top figures. For a group that prided itself on continuity and hierarchy, the level of internal bloodletting was unprecedented. It also had the effect of profoundly reshaping the organization into something more firmly centered on Scarfo and his immediate circle, including his nephew and underboss, Philip Leonetti, and his favored protege, Salvi Testa. Amid this internal turmoil, the legal cases that had loomed over Philip Testa in his final months did not simply vanish. The federal prosecution targeting corruption in roofers Local 3030 be moved forward, even though the man once described as a central underworld figure in the scheme was now dead. Prosecutors restructured aspects of their case, focusing more intensely on surviving defendants. Union leaders, contractors, and other mob associates accused of using violence and threats to control contracts and siphon money from both employers and the union itself. Testa's death influenced the proceedings in subtle ways. Defense attorneys pointed to the chaos in the Philadelphia underworld as evidence that the government's portrayal of a stable, centrally directed criminal enterprise was overstated. Prosecutors countered that the violence merely underscored the length to which underworld figures would go to protect and reorganize their rackets. In the end, the roofers' case produced significant convictions among union officials and associates, confirming that organized crime had penetrated deeply into the construction trades. But Testa himself was now a name, rather than a presence in the courtroom, a man whose alleged role had to be described in past tense. For investigators who had spent years tracking him, this posthumous transition was jarring. Files that once anticipated his eventual conviction now became the basis for analytical reports and historical reconstructions. FBI analysts and state crime commissions used the Testa era as a case study in how an immigrant-based crime family evolved, how it sought to control labor and gambling markets, and how internal disputes, when combined with external legal pressure, could produce waves of lethal conflict. In the neighborhood where he had lived and died, the shift was more personal and more ambiguous. Some neighbors, asked by reporters about the man whose house had been destroyed by a bomb, spoke cautiously. They described him as quiet, as someone who nodded in greeting, as a man who shopped locally and attended church. Few claimed to know much about his business dealings, and some insisted they preferred not to. For them, the sudden violence on their block was less a commentary on organized crime than a violation of the unwritten understanding that such matters stayed invisible and away from family doorsteps. Other residents saw the series of killings as a sign that a long-standing balance had broken down. During Bruno's tenure, they said, things were quieter, disputes were handled, and ordinary people felt less likely to be caught in the crossfire. The explosions and street shootings of the early 1980s shattered that perception. Parents worried about their children walking past certain corners. Small business owners reconsidered how openly they wanted to defy demands from anyone claiming underworld connections. In this sense, Testa's death was not just the end of one man's life, but a turning point in how safe, or unsafe, the neighborhood felt. Despite his central role in this upheaval, Philip Testa left a relatively faint public footprint. Unlike some figures in American organized crime who became well known during their lifetimes through flamboyance or headline-making trials, Testa had spent most of his career operating in the background. Few photographs of him appeared in the press, and those that did were usually taken as he entered or left court buildings, looking down or away from the cameras. He granted no interviews and left no recorded statements beyond court testimony, which he generally kept as narrow as possible. As a result, our understanding of his character and methods comes largely from the testimony of others, often given years later under plea agreements or witness protection arrangements, and from the interpretations of journalists and law enforcement officials who studied the Philadelphia family. These sources portray him as conservative in his approach to business, loyal to Bruno, and valued for his ability to serve as a bridge between older Sicilian-born members and the American-born younger generation. They also depict him as fully committed to the enterprises that made the family profitable: gambling, loan sharking, and influence over unions and certain businesses. That duality, quiet demeanor, serious crimes, helps explain why his death resonated so strongly in both law enforcement and underworld circles. To the FBI and the Pennsylvania Crime Commission, he embodied a particular stage in the evolution of the Philadelphia family, the period when it shifted from the bootlegging and fragmentary rackets of earlier decades to a more structured, corporate-style organization embedded in legitimate-looking industries. To younger mobsters and associates, he represented the last link to the Bruno era, an era they remembered, however selectively, as more predictable. For his son, Salvi, the impact was direct and immediate. The loss of his father, combined with the knowledge that the killing had come from within their own organization, deepened his loyalty to Scarfo, who presented himself as the avenger of the Testa name. Salvi's position within the family rose accordingly. Under Scarfo, he commanded a powerful crew, collected on gambling and loan debts, and took part in decisions that shaped the family's direction in the first half of the 1980s. Law enforcement sources from that time frequently mention him as one of the most active and influential young figures in the Philadelphia underworld. Yet the same internal dynamics that had claimed his father would eventually place Salvi in jeopardy as well. Scarfo's regime, while initially consolidated through acts of vengeance for Testa's murder, gradually became synonymous with pervasive fear. Disagreements that might once have been resolved through negotiation or demotion now increasingly led to lethal outcomes. Scarfo's suspicion of potential rivals extended even to those he had once favored. In this climate, Loyalty could be rewarded for a time, but offered no ultimate protection. As the years passed, the story of Philip Testa's life and death continued to reverberate through legal proceedings and public discussions. The Pennsylvania Crime Commission issued detailed reports on organized crime in the state, devoting long sections to the events of 1976-1983, including the Bruno and Testa assassinations and the subsequent reshuffling of the Philadelphia family. These reports, while careful to distinguish between proven facts and informed assessments, helped fix Testa's place in the historical record, not as a colorful celebrity criminal, but as a key transitional figure whose killing accelerated the descent into a more chaotic and violent phase. Nationally, the name Chicken Man took on a different kind of resonance. A few years after Testa's death, a popular song released by a New Jersey-born musician included a stark line about a chicken man blown up in Philadelphia. The reference was brief and not elaborated upon, but its inclusion in a widely heard piece of music exposed Testa's nickname, and by extension, his death, to listeners who might never have read a crime report or a Pennsylvania Crime Commission document. In this way, a man who had largely avoided public attention during his life became, in death, a symbolic shorthand for the dangers and dramas of organized crime in the late 20th century. Behind the cultural references and official analyses, however, lay a more prosaic reality: the trajectory of a man whose choices were shaped by specific circumstances, an immigrant childhood in a poor, tightly knit neighborhood, proximity to older men already involved in illegal enterprises, limited legitimate economic options, and the gradual normalization of illicit work as a path to influence and security. None of these factors made his involvement inevitable. Many from similar backgrounds chose different routes, but taken together, they frame his life as part of a broader pattern in American urban history, one in which organized crime appealed to a subset of men as both a livelihood and an identity. By the time the full ramifications of the Scarfo era came into view, years of internal killing, expanded rackets, and eventually sweeping federal prosecutions, Philip Testa had been dead for nearly a decade. Yet his brief tenure as boss and the manner of his death continued to shape how both insiders and outsiders understood what followed. To some within the family, Scarfo's reign was justified, at least initially, as a necessary corrective to the treachery that had felled Testa. To prosecutors and agents, the bombing on Porter Street marked the moment when the old restraints on violence in Philadelphia finally gave way, opening the door to a period that would ultimately help bring the organization to its knees. In that sense, the story of Philip Charles Testa does not end with the explosion that took his life. It extends into the careers of those who replaced him, into the trials that reconstructed his role from witness stands and surveillance tapes, and into the ways his name has been invoked as a reminder of what can happen when internal rivalries intersect with the pressure of determined law enforcement. His life, from Sicilian birth to South Philadelphia, upbringing to ascension and assassination, remains a cautionary chapter in the longer, often troubled history of organized crime in the United States. In the years after the Porter Street bombing, the man at the center of that blast moved from being a living presence in South Philadelphia to a subject reconstructed in courtrooms and commission reports. The story of Philip Charles Testa did not end with his funeral. It continued as others, prosecutors, former associates, journalists, and historians, tried to explain how a quiet immigrant from Sicily had risen to lead a powerful criminal organization, only to be killed by his own underworld peers. Federal prosecutors in Philadelphia had already spent much of the 1970s and early 1980s assembling cases that reached back into the Bruno era and through Testa's brief tenure. After his death, their focus turned even more sharply to the man who now ran the family, Nicodemo, Little Nicky, Scarfo. Scarfo's time as boss would be characterized by a much more visible and pervasive use of violence than anything seen under Bruno or Testa. but in order to persuade juries that the organization he led was a long-standing criminal enterprise, prosecutors had to tell the story of how it had functioned under his predecessors. That story began to emerge in detail in the mid-1980s, when the pressure of investigations and potential prison terms pushed some members and associates of the Philadelphia family to break the long-standing code of silence. Early cooperators included figures like Thomas, Tommy Del Giorn, and Nicholas, Nicky Crow Caramandi, men who had operated on the street level but knew the patterns and personalities of those above them. Later, the most consequential defection came from within the leadership itself. Scarfo's own underboss and nephew, Philip Leonetti, who agreed in 1989 to testify for the government. On the witness stand in federal court and before grand juries, these men described not only Scarfo's reign but the eras of Bruno and Testa as well. They traced the passing of envelopes, the rituals of meetings, and the unwritten rules that governed promotions and punishments. Again and again, the name of Philip Testa surfaced, sometimes as an active participant, more often as a steady presence whose decisions signaled the direction of the family. The portrait that emerged from this testimony was nuanced. Former insiders contrasted Testa's approach with the harsher style that followed. Under Bruno and Testa, they recalled, the family still engaged in serious crime. Loans at crushing interest rates, control of illegal gambling, manipulation of labor unions, and when deemed necessary, the use of lethal force. But they emphasized that this force was applied sparingly, with considerable discussion at higher levels. Violence was seen as a last resort, to be weighed against the risk of attracting law enforcement attention. By comparison, the Scarfo era, which directly followed Testa's assassination, appeared far more volatile. Disputes that might once have been settled through quiet demotion or reassignment now often ended with bodies on sidewalks or in alleys. Cooperating witnesses, describing this shift, frequently treated Testa as the hinge between two worlds, the final representative of a more restrained, old-style leadership, and the immediate victim of the ruthless competition that would define the early 1980s. In these courtroom narratives, Testa's roots in Sicily and South Philadelphia took on renewed significance. Prosecutors highlighted that he, like Bruno, had been born in Italy and come up in the close-knit immigrant communities of the city, absorbing both traditional values and the underworld ethos that circulated in those neighborhoods. Cooperators described him as someone who commanded quiet respect, a man whose word carried weight because he did not waste it on theatrics. Even government witnesses, who went on to detail his role in serious crimes, tended to speak of him with a certain measured tone, differentiating him from more flamboyant or impulsive figures. At the same time, the testimony made clear that the illegal activities he engaged in were wide-ranging and deeply woven into the civic fabric of Philadelphia and nearby New Jersey. Witnesses explained how, under Bruno and Testa, the family exerted influence over bars, restaurants, construction projects, and unions. They described how bookmakers and loan sharks handled bets and loans on behalf of higher-ups, how collection routes were assigned, and how disputes over territory or money were brought to figures like Testa for resolution. One recurring theme in these accounts was Testa's involvement in labor racketeering, particularly in the building trades. The roofers' union case that had loomed over him in the months before his death remained central to this part of the story. Prosecutors pieced together a picture in which organized crime figures and certain union leaders stood between contractors and major projects, pressuring businesses to hire particular firms, use certain suppliers, or make under-the-table payments in order to avoid slowdowns or picket lines. While specific details varied from witness to witness, the basic pattern was consistent. The union's legitimate bargaining power had, at times, been harnessed to enrich underworld figures. Because Testa had died before standing trial in that case, the charges against him were never tested before a jury. Yet his alleged role in the scheme continued to be discussed in later proceedings, as witnesses and investigators sought to explain how the roofers' union had become entangled with the family. In this sense, his legal conflicts did not end with his death. They became part of a larger narrative used to illustrate the reach of organized crime into everyday economic life. As the Scarfo prosecutions advanced, the fate of Testa's son, Salvatore, cast an even more somber light on the legacy of the Porter Street bombing. Salvi, as he was known, had risen quickly under his father and then under Scarfo. Young, driven, and feared on the street, he represented a second generation of South Philadelphia men for whom involvement in the family was both a job and a matter of identity. To many in the underworld, he was considered a likely future boss. To law enforcement, he was seen as one of the most dangerous and determined of the younger soldiers. In the early 1980s, Salvi's standing only grew. He survived legal challenges that might have derailed a less connected figure, and emerged with a reputation for resilience. Cooperating witnesses later recalled that his ability to navigate indictments and investigations enhanced his stature among peers, who saw him as both capable and lucky. He was trusted by Scarfo, admired by some older members for his energy, and feared by many associates aware of his willingness to enforce debts and discipline. Yet the same internal strains that had cost his father his life still ran through the family. Scarfo, increasingly surrounded by conflict and pressure, became more suspicious with time, especially of those who seemed to command loyalty in their own right. Personal relationships, family ties, and perceived slights all took on outsized importance in an atmosphere where a casual comment could be interpreted as disloyalty. It was in this context that Salvi's story took a dark turn. Accounts from later cooperators and investigative reports describe how a personal matter, a broken engagement involving a woman connected to Scarfo's extended family, fueled tensions between the boss and his once favored protege. What might have remained a private dispute in another setting became, in Scarfo's mind, a question of respect and authority. Combined with his growing unease about Salvi's popularity and independent base of support, it set the stage for another betrayal. In September 1984, only 3 years after his father's death, Salvatore Testa was himself killed. He was lured to a meeting by men he considered allies and shot. His body was later found dumped in New Jersey. For those who had seen him as the natural heir to the Testa name, the murder was at once shocking and grimly familiar. Like his father, he had been eliminated by people within the organization to which he had devoted his life. When this killing eventually came under scrutiny in federal court, cooperating witnesses testified that Scarfo had ordered it, seeing Salvi no longer as the son of a revered former boss, but as a potential rival and a man who had, in his eyes, shown disrespect. Leonetti, Scarfo's underboss, would later describe his own participation in the planning of the murder, providing prosecutors with an insider's account of how the decision was made and carried out. In telling that story, he tied Salvi's fate directly back to the climate of suspicion and unchecked power that had followed the Testa bombing. For investigators and historians, the deaths of both father and son, at the hands of men ostensibly bound to them by a code of loyalty, illustrated the complexity and fragility of those bonds. The same unwritten rules that demanded obedience and silence could not prevent the erosion of trust when ambition, fear, and legal pressure mounted. Over time, the double tragedy of the Testa family became a cautionary thread running through discussions of organized crime, a reminder that status offered no guarantee of safety, and that the inner workings of such organizations were ultimately governed by shifting calculations rather than enduring loyalties. As Scarfo's regime continued into the mid-1980s, the cumulative effect of high-profile murders, persistent extortion, and growing attention from informants eventually produced the comprehensive legal assault that law enforcement had long sought. Federal prosecutors brought sweeping racketeering indictments against Scarfo and many of his top associates, charging them with a pattern of crimes that included murders, attempted murders, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and labor racketeering. The indictments did more than catalog individual offenses. They presented a narrative of how the family had operated over 2 decades, from the late Bruno years through Testa's brief leadership and into Scarfo's violent tenure. In these documents and the trials that followed, the Bruno and Testa eras were treated as the foundation upon which the Scarfo regime had been built. Prosecutors argued that the structure and practices that enabled Scarfo's crimes had been established years earlier by men like Bruno and Testa. Defense attorneys, by contrast, often sought to separate their clients from that history, either by downplaying their connections to earlier bosses or by suggesting that the violence of the Scarfo years represented a break with the past rather than a continuation. By 1988, the results of this legal campaign were clear. Scarfo was convicted on federal racketeering charges and sentenced to a long prison term, effectively ending his capacity to lead the family. Many of his closest associates received similarly heavy sentences. The trials, fueled by the testimony of former insiders, laid bare the organization's inner workings in a way that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. For the first time, juries and the general public heard detailed accounts of how men like Philip Testa had risen, wielded influence, and fallen within the structure of a modern American mafia family. Parallel to these courtroom proceedings, the Pennsylvania Crime Commission released extensive investigative reports on organized crime in the state. These reports, drawing on years of surveillance, informant interviews, and court documents, devoted considerable space to the history of the Philadelphia family. They tracked its evolution from the early days of Prohibition through the Bruno and Testa years and into the Scarfo era. In those pages, Testa appeared not simply as a footnote between two more widely known bosses, but as a central figure in the transition from one style of leadership to another. Commission analysts emphasized his role as a stabilizer after Bruno's assassination, someone whose appointment as boss had been intended to reassure higher-level mafia leaders in New York. At the same time, they noted that his involvement in labor racketeering and his proximity to Scarfo positioned him in the middle of the very forces that would later destabilize the family. To the commission, the bombing that killed him was less an isolated act of treachery than the manifestation of structural strains that had been building for years. Grievances about money and influence, unease about shifting alliances, and anxieties about the growing power of younger, more aggressive figures. Beyond official reports and courtroom testimony, the story of the Testa years also filtered into the broader public through books and, later, documentaries. Investigative journalists who had covered Bruno's quiet tenure and Scarfo's violent downfall produced detailed accounts that filled in the spaces between formal legal narratives. In these works, Testa often emerged as a somewhat enigmatic figure, visible enough to be recognized as a pivotal player, yet elusive enough that his personal thoughts and motivations had to be inferred from the actions and words of others. Former mobsters who wrote memoirs or cooperated with authors contributed to this portrait. Some described Testa as old school, a man who valued order and predictability. Others recalled how he and Bruno had tried to keep Atlantic City's emerging casino economy under disciplined control, only to see that effort unravel amid internal competition and outside pressure. Whatever their perspective, these accounts almost uniformly situated his assassination as a turning point, a moment when the Philadelphia family crossed a threshold into a period of sustained chaos. In the cultural realm, the brief lyrical reference that linked the phrase, "blew up the chicken man in Philly last night," to the broader malaise of an economically struggling region helped fix his death in the popular imagination. Listeners who knew little about the internal politics of the Philadelphia family nonetheless absorbed the image of a crime figure killed by a bomb in his own city, a sign of decay and danger lurking beneath the surface of ordinary life. Over time, the line became a shorthand for the disillusionment that marked many post-industrial communities in the 1980s, even as the actual details of Testa's life remained unknown to most. Yet beneath these layers of interpretation and representation, the core facts of his story remained grounded in a specific place and time. He had been born in a small town in Sicily and raised in a South Philadelphia neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and the presence of organized crime was tangible. He had chosen to align himself with that underworld, rising through its ranks to become a trusted deputy and then a boss. He had participated in and benefited from illegal enterprises that harmed victims in ways that might not always have been physically dramatic, but were nonetheless deeply consequential, driving families into debt, distorting labor markets, and fostering a culture of fear and silence. Law enforcement's eventual success in dismantling much of the Philadelphia family's power, at least in its traditional form, did not erase the effects of those earlier decades. Union corruption left a legacy of mistrust in the building trades. Communities that had lived for years under the shadow of underworld influence had to navigate a new reality in which the old figures were either in prison deceased or operating at a diminished capacity. For some residents, this brought a sense of relief. For others, especially those whose livelihoods had been tied, however indirectly, to the old arrangements, it created uncertainty. In academic and policy discussions about organized crime, Testa's life began to be cited as a case study in the mid to late 20th century American mafia experience. Scholars interested in the sociology of crime pointed to his story as an example of how immigrant origin networks could evolve into entrenched criminal organizations, and how those organizations, in turn, could be shaped and eventually disrupted by changes in law, economics, and law enforcement strategy. His trajectory illustrated the interplay between personal agency and structural forces. He made choices, but he made them within a constrained set of options shaped by his time, place, and social environment. Even within the FBI and local police departments, where active operations always took precedence over historical reflection, there was a sense that the Testa era had marked a watershed. Agents who had staked out his home, monitored his meetings, or prepared to prosecute him in the roofer's case now filed reports that placed his life in a larger narrative arc. They traced lines from his early gambling arrests to later labor racketeering schemes, from his cautious style under Bruno to the explosion that ended his tenure, and from that explosion to the unraveling of the Scarfo regime that followed. In all of these tellings, legal, journalistic, scholarly, and cultural, Philip Charles Testa remained both a central character and, in some ways, a shadowed one. The absence of direct statements from him, the limited photographic record, and the brevity of his reign as boss left space for interpretation. Yet the convergence of evidence from multiple independent sources, court documents, commission reports, witness testimony, and contemporaneous news accounts anchored the key elements of his story firmly in the historical record. By the close of the 20th century, the Philadelphia family was a very different entity from the one that had taken shape in the days of Salvatore Sabella, or even from the organization Bruno had led for 2 decades. Many of its most powerful figures were gone, and the wider mafia landscape in the United States had been changed by aggressive prosecutions, changing demographics, and shifts in criminal markets. In this transformed environment, the figure of Philip Testa stood as a reminder of a particular moment when traditional hierarchies still held sway, when South Philadelphia's row house blocks were the nerve center of a significant criminal enterprise, and when the lethal contest for control of that enterprise spilled directly into the lives and streets of an American city. In the years after the last big trials ended and the headlines moved on, the row house on Porter Street, where Philip Charles Testa was killed, settled back into the background of South Philadelphia life. New paint, new occupants, and the slow churn of a changing neighborhood blurred its connection to the events of March 1981. But in law enforcement offices, academic studies, and the memories of those who had lived through that turbulent period, the story of the Chicken Man remained a touchstone for understanding how one city's underworld had risen, fractured, and in many respects destroyed itself. By the early 1990s, a new generation of organized crime leaders in Philadelphia had come to power. The Scarfo regime, which had defined the decade after Testa's death with its almost relentless resort to violence, had been gutted by federal prosecutions. In its place, rival factions struggled for control. One group coalesced around John Stanfa, the same man who, a dozen years earlier, had been behind the wheel of Angelo Bruno's car the night Bruno was murdered. Another circle revolved around Joseph, Skinny Joey, Merlino, a younger, more flamboyant figure whose brash public style contrasted sharply with the quiet caution of Bruno and Testa. For these later players, the Bruno and Testa years existed as a kind of distant reference point. Ralph Nacho, a one-time Philadelphia boss who later cooperated with authorities, and Philip Leonetti, Scarfo's former underboss turned government witness, both spoke and wrote about the earlier era as they had seen or heard about it. In their accounts, Testa's brief time as boss was often described as a final attempt to preserve an old order, one rooted in Sicilian birth, South Philadelphia upbringing, and a relatively low public profile. Even as they recounted his participation in serious crimes, they tended to frame him as a stabilizing force amid emerging turbulence. These retrospective assessments inevitably raised a difficult question. If Testa had not been killed, would the Philadelphia family have avoided the extreme bloodshed and legal disaster that characterized the Scarfo years? Prosecutors, investigators, and former insiders offered differing views. Some argued that Testa's temperament and his long-standing relationship with Bruno suggested he would have continued to favor measured responses, careful diplomacy with New York, and limited resort to killings. Others countered that the same economic and legal pressures that drove Scarfo's behavior, competition over Atlantic City profits, intensifying RICO prosecutions, and the ambitions of younger associates, would eventually have confronted Testa as well, forcing choices that might not have looked very different in the end. What was clear, in hindsight, was that the assassination on Porter Street removed a leader whose style and personal history tied Philadelphia's underworld to its mid-century roots. Born in Sicily and shaped by an immigrant South Philadelphia childhood, Testa inhabited a world in which Cosa Nostra still thought of itself as an organization of men bound by shared cultural codes and the memory of village loyalties. By the 1980s and 1990s, those bonds were under strain everywhere. The sons and grandsons of the original immigrants grew up in a more fluid America, with broader horizons and, in some cases, fewer inhibitions about turning on former allies when faced with decades-long prison sentences. The growing use of cooperating witnesses in organized crime cases underscored this shift. When Leonetti took the stand in the late 1980s and early 1990s to testify against his uncle Scarfo and others, he also offered glimpses into how the family had functioned under Bruno and Testa. He described the rituals of making new members, the unwritten rules against targeting law enforcement officers, and the expectation that serious decisions, especially about violence, would be discussed among top leaders before action was taken. Those practices were already fraying by the time of Testa's death, but his presence, older insiders suggested, had still exerted some moderating influence. The unraveling of those internal constraints had implications far beyond the underworld. In South Philadelphia and nearby New Jersey communities, people who had long lived with the quiet, sometimes uneasy presence of men like Bruno and Testa now experienced a more visible and unpredictable underworld. Cars were bombed, people ambushed at stoplights, and gunfire rang out in parking lots and on busy streets. Trials in the 1990s featured testimony about plots to attack rivals in public places with little regard for bystanders. To many residents, the comparative calm of the Bruno Testa period, for all its hidden harms, came to seem like another era entirely. At the same time, the neighborhoods that had nurtured Testa's generation were themselves changing. Economic restructuring in Philadelphia had hollowed out many of the blue-collar jobs that had once supported Italian-American families in South Philadelphia. Younger residents, including the children and grandchildren of earlier immigrants, increasingly moved to the suburbs or pursued professional careers. New waves of immigrants and other newcomers arrived, diversifying the area's demographics. Small groceries, butcher shops, and social clubs gave way, in some blocks, to restaurants, cafes, and new kinds of businesses that catered to a broader mix of customers. This transformation did not erase the memory of the Underworld era, but it reframed it. For longtime residents, the names Bruno and Testa evoked not just crime stories, but a cluster of associations with a particular version of South Philadelphia. Tight-knit, culturally specific, suspicious of outsiders, and governed, at least in part, by men whose authority did not come from official office. For newer arrivals, that history often appeared abstract, something they might encounter in a newspaper article or hear about from older neighbors but not directly experience. Meanwhile, within the broader Italian-American community, the very visibility of mafia narratives in film, television, and music prompted debate, and at times pushback. Advocacy organizations argued that the outsized attention paid to mobsters reinforced stereotypes about Italian Americans as inherently connected to organized crime. They pointed out that the vast majority of Italian Americans had built their lives in legitimate work, in small businesses, trades, and professions, bearing no resemblance to the figures portrayed in popular culture. In that context, the high-profile stories of men like Testa took on a dual character, historically significant but also potentially distortive, overshadowing a broader and more diverse community experience. Academic researchers tried to balance these concerns by situating figures like Testa in a larger framework. Studies of ethnic succession in American cities examined how, in certain times and places, segments of immigrant communities became involved in organized crime, often exploiting networks of trust and silence that had originally evolved to help families navigate discrimination and economic hardship. In Philadelphia, that meant tracing lines from early 20th century Sicilian and Neapolitan enclaves through the Sabella, Bruno, and Testa periods, and into the complex, fragmented landscape of the late 20th century. In this scholarship, Testa often appeared at the junction of two patterns. On the one hand, his life trajectory fitted a familiar model, the son of a struggling immigrant family. Drawn into the underworld as a way to gain status and financial security in a society that offered limited legitimate avenues for advancement. On the other, his death by bomb, a weapon seldom used in American mafia conflicts, where shootings and stabbings had been more typical, signaled the breakdown of older norms. Scholars noted that the choice of method, a nail-filled explosive placed at a home, showed a willingness to adopt tactics that were more indiscriminate and more likely to endanger bystanders than traditional targeted attacks. Law enforcement officials analyzing the Porter Street bombing emphasized the same point. For decades, the American mafia had generally tried to avoid tactics that looked too much like terrorism, fearing the public outrage and intense political response that such acts could provoke. Bombings had occurred, but they were comparatively rare. The decision to kill Testa in that manner, investigators later suggested, reflected both desperation and a misreading of the long-term consequences. It solved, temporarily, a leadership dispute, but it also strengthened the hand of prosecutors and politicians who argued that the old claims about honor and rules within the mafia were myths. Within South Philadelphia's parishes and community organizations, Conversations about these issues were often quieter, but no less significant. Priests who had heard confessions from men on all sides of the law, social workers who had grown up alongside future mob figures, and teachers who had watched students pulled toward different paths, all grappled with the legacy of the Testa era. Some emphasized the importance of offering young people alternatives to the underworld's promises of quick money and respect. Others focused on breaking down the culture of silence that had allowed criminal organizations to flourish in their midst for so long. Over time, these community efforts intersected with shifts in policing strategy. In the decades after Testa's death, law enforcement agencies in Philadelphia experimented with new approaches to organized crime and street-level violence alike. Multi-agency task forces combined the efforts of federal, state, and local officers. Witness protection programs were strengthened to encourage more insiders to come forward. Prosecutors learned to use financial records, wiretaps, and cooperating witnesses to build cases that did not depend solely on the testimony of victims afraid of retaliation. Those tools once aimed primarily at traditional mafia families like the one Testa had led, were increasingly deployed against newer forms of organized crime, drug gangs, interstate fraud rings, and other groups that did not fit the old patterns of ethnic hierarchy and ritual, but posed similar or greater threats to public safety. In this broader context, the Philadelphia family's history, including Testa's rise and fall, became part of a training curriculum. Young agents and prosecutors studied it not only to learn about the past, but to understand how criminal organizations adapt and how they can be disrupted. At the same time, former criminal figures themselves contributed to this process of reflection. Men like Leonetti, Caramandi, and others who had turned state's evidence spoke publicly, in interviews and sometimes in lectures to law enforcement audiences, about the costs of their former lives. They described prison terms, betrayals, and the fear that had haunted even their most profitable days. When they spoke about Testa, their tone was often ambivalent, critical of his role in crimes, yet tinged with a measure of respect for his comparatively restrained style, and for the stability he had represented before the Scarfo era fully took hold. These recollections did not excuse or romanticize the harm he helped inflict, but they offered a textured view that contrasted with one-dimensional portrayals of mobsters as either glamorous anti-hero or faceless villains. They showed how someone like Testa could be simultaneously a family man in his private life and a key architect of systems that extracted money through coercion and fear. The popular imagination, however, subtlety often yielded to simplification. Films and television shows about organized crime, even when set in New York or fictional cities, drew on a shared repertoire of images and archetypes. The aging boss in a modest house, the Catholic funeral with a heavy underworld presence, the row house or corner bar where important conversations took place. Such scenes, while not always based directly on the details of Testa's life, echoed aspects of his story. Viewers who heard a passing reference to a chicken man in a song or saw a dramatized bombing on a narrow street might have recognized only a mood, not a specific event. For those who sought to disentangle myth from reality, primary sources remained crucial. Pennsylvania Crime Commission reports, FBI declassified files, and contemporaneous newspaper coverage provided anchors in a sea of later interpretation. These materials documented, often in dry, bureaucratic language, the facts of Testa's arrests, his appearance in surveillance photos, his ownership of certain businesses, and his known associations. They traced the flow of money within gambling and loan sharking operations, and mapped the connections between South Philadelphia, Atlantic City, and New York. By reading these documents alongside the testimonies of former mobsters and the recollections of community members, historians and journalists could reconstruct a fuller picture. They could show how an immigrant family's search for stability intersected with the opportunities and dangers of a particular urban environment, how local traditions of mutual aid and distrust of outside authority could, under certain conditions, be exploited by criminal organizations, and how one man's choices, made incrementally over years, led inevitably toward the risks and eventual fate of high-ranking underworld life. The human dimension of that story remained inescapable. Behind the headlines about bosses and bombs were the quieter experiences of people whose lives intersected with Testa, in less dramatic ways. Neighbors who shared holiday greetings, small business owners who faced pressure to tolerate illegal betting or pay for protection, relatives who knew only parts of what he was involved in. For them, his death was not only a chapter in a history of organized crime, but a personal loss, or an unsettling reminder of how thin the line could be between the ordinary and the dangerous in certain neighborhoods and times. By the dawn of the 21st century, the world that had produced Philip Charles Testa was largely gone. The South Philadelphia of tightly clustered Italian parishes and omnipresent corner clubs had given way to a more varied cityscape. The Philadelphia family, while still present in diminished form, no longer wielded the kind of broad influence it had under Bruno and Testa. New criminal threats, new economic realities, and new communities occupied the space where the old networks had once operated. Yet when journalists or filmmakers returned to the subject of Philadelphia's mob history, they invariably circled back to the early 1980s, to the twin killings of Bruno and Testa, as pivotal moments. Those events, seen together, encapsulated the contradictions of an underworld that aspired to order but succumbed to its own internal tensions. Bruno's assassination revealed the willingness of ambitious insiders to defy long-standing rules for personal gain. Testa's bombing demonstrated how far that disregard for tradition could go, turning family homes into battlegrounds in a struggle for power. In this sense, the story of Philip Testa continued to resonate well beyond the years of his life. It stood as a reminder that the line between myth and reality in discussions of organized crime is often thin, and that the men at the center of those stories were neither caricatures nor romanticized figures, but complex participants in systems that caused real, lasting harm. His journey, from a Sicilian birthplace to a South Philadelphia childhood, from a quiet rise through the ranks to a brief and ultimately fatal tenure as boss, remained a vivid illustration of how individual biographies and broader social forces can intertwine, with consequences that echo far beyond a single life or a single block of row houses. For people trying to make sense of that story today, Philip Charles Testa sits at a crossroads between personal biography and the wider history of an American city. His name rarely appears in schoolbooks, and his presence in popular culture is limited to a nickname and a single, stark lyric. Yet when investigators, scholars, or longtime residents reflect on how organized crime shaped Philadelphia in the 20th century, his life and death form one of the key hinges in that narrative. The basic outline is easy enough to recite. Sicilian birth, South Philadelphia childhood, steady rise under Angelo Bruno, brief tenure as boss, death by bomb on his own front step. Behind that outline, however, lies a dense web of causes and consequences that stretch from the migration patterns of the early 1900s to the legal reforms and community changes of the 1980s and beyond. Testa's story cannot be understood in isolation from those larger forces, nor can those forces be fully grasped without acknowledging how men like him acted within them. One of the enduring questions surrounding his career is how much room for maneuver he really had. By the time he emerged as a central figure in the Philadelphia family, the organization had already been operating for decades. Its methods, illegal gambling, loan sharking, use of violence as a tool of control, penetration of certain unions and businesses, were well established. Bruno's long reign had shown that a boss could adjust the tone and tempo of that activity, preferring negotiation to dramatic shows of force, but not that he could transform the basic nature of the enterprise. Testa inherited this structure rather than inventing it, and his choices were constrained by its expectations and by the pressures of rivals, allies, and outside authorities. Yet within those constraints, his particular style mattered. The portrait painted by former associates and law enforcement observers is of a man who, while fully implicated in criminal schemes, preferred predictability. Under his watch as underboss and then as boss, the family sought to keep money flowing steadily, avoiding the kind of public turmoil that had brought federal heat on other cities. That preference did not make the organization less harmful to its victims. It did, however, shape the timing and manner of conflicts within the underworld, delaying but not preventing the outburst of violence that ultimately claimed his life. The exact motives behind the decision to kill him remain a subject of debate among those who study the case. Official investigative bodies like the Pennsylvania Crime Commission, drawing on informant reports and circumstantial evidence, concluded that underboss Pete Casella, Capo Frank Narducci S.R., and their ally Rocco Marinucci formed the core of the conspiracy, driven by fear that Testa's legal troubles and alliances would leave them marginalized or exposed. Some later accounts from cooperating mobsters support this view, emphasizing resentment over money and influence, as well as anxiety about Scarfo's rising power in the Testa inner circle. Other observers point to subtler factors: unease over generational change, disagreements about how aggressively to exploit new markets like Atlantic City, and differing levels of comfort with the growing federal use of RICO charges. What most agree on is that the bombing did not arise from a single argument or insult, but from overlapping grievances that had been building beneath the surface for years. In that sense, the device placed on Porter Street was the physical manifestation of long-term structural tension inside a criminal organization under pressure. If there is mystery about the precise balance of motives, there is less uncertainty about the consequences. The chain of assassinations and reprisals that followed Testa's killing fundamentally altered the Philadelphia family. Scarfo's ascent, the exile of Casella, the murders of Narducci and others, and the eventual defection of key insiders like Leonetti and Del Giorno set the stage for the sweeping federal prosecutions that targeted the family in the late 1980s. Testa did not live to see those trials, but his death marked the point at which the old order finally gave way to a more openly violent and, ultimately, self-destructive phase. Amid this focus on internal power struggles, it can be easy to lose sight of the broader circle of people affected by the activities in which Testa was involved. Court documents, commission reports, and victim statements from the period provide glimpses into the everyday impact of the rackets he helped oversee. Small business owners described being approached by men who, while polite on the surface, made it clear that refusing to allow betting on the premises or declining security arrangements would be unwise. Contractors testified about being steered toward particular suppliers or union contacts, with the implicit understanding that non-compliance could bring costly delays or labor problems. Individuals who became entangled in loan-sharking operations told of borrowing money at steep interest rates when they had nowhere else to turn, after a job loss, a medical bill, or gambling losses, and finding themselves trapped in cycles of debt. Even when physical harm was not inflicted, the constant fear of it was a powerful form of control. Organized crime of this sort rarely produced the kind of singular, headline-grabbing tragedies that dominate popular narratives. Instead, it exerted a chronic, grinding pressure on the lives of hundreds of people over many years. The corruption of unions added another layer of harm. When underworld figures like Testa and his peers influenced leadership in locals such as Roofers 3030B, the costs were borne not only by targeted contractors, but also by rank-and-file workers whose benefits and job security were compromised. Pension funds could be mismanaged, jobs allocated on the basis of favoritism and external influence rather than seniority or skill, and the union's power at the bargaining table diverted in part to serve the financial interests of a criminal minority. These were not abstract issues. They affected whether families could rely on steady work, fair wages, and secure retirements. Understanding this broader impact is essential to avoiding the romanticization of figures like Testa. The relative lack of sensational public violence during much of his career under Bruno does not mean that harm was absent. It means that the harm was more often hidden in financial ledgers, whispered threats, and the quiet adjustments people made to avoid trouble. When assessing his life, historians and documentarians must hold both sides in view: the personal qualities that made him, by many accounts, a more measured leader than those who followed, and the systemic damage caused by the very enterprises he helped sustain. At the same time, a complete picture requires acknowledging that Testa's path was not inevitable, even if the environment in which he grew up made it more plausible. South Philadelphia's Italian-American neighborhoods produced thousands of men from similar backgrounds, sons of Sicilian or Southern Italian parents, raised in tight quarters amid economic hardship, who never joined the mafia. Some became small business owners, tradesmen, or professionals. Others lived quiet working-class lives. The presence of organized crime was a reality, but it was not a destiny inscribed at birth. What distinguished those who entered the underworld from those who did not often came down to a combination of personal inclination, chance encounters, and the pull of particular relationships. In Testa's case, long-standing ties to Bruno and other older figures created a sense of loyalty and shared purpose that guided his choices. The respect he earned within that world, and the material benefits it brought, reinforced his commitment. Over time, the boundary between neighborhood loyalty and criminal allegiance blurred, making it harder to disentangle one from the other. That blurred boundary is part of what made organized crime so persistent in places like South Philadelphia. The same networks of kinship and mutual aid that had helped immigrant families survive discrimination and exploitation in earlier decades could, under certain conditions, be repurposed to support illicit enterprises. The old stories of village connections in Sicily, the emphasis on family reputation, and the habit of handling disputes internally rather than involving outside authorities all made it easier for groups like the Philadelphia family to sustain themselves. They presented themselves, at least to some, as defenders of community interests against outsiders, even as they extracted money and cooperation through fear. The decline of that model in the late 20th century owed much to factors far beyond any one individual's control: the globalization of drug markets and other criminal opportunities, the rise of new, more fluid gang structures, the increasing diversity of urban neighborhoods, and the determined use of legal tools like RICO and witness protection programs. In that changing environment, traditional mafia families struggled to maintain the kind of insulated, ethnically cohesive base that had once been their strength. From this perspective, Testa's life can be seen as spanning the period from the height of that earlier model to its unraveling. As a child and young man, he inhabited a world where South Philadelphia's Italian-American enclaves were relatively closed and self-contained, and where figures like Bruno could draw on a deep reservoir of cultural familiarity. As a mature leader, he faced a city and a legal system that were far less forgiving, and a criminal landscape increasingly shaped by external forces: the pull of Atlantic City, the encroachment of independent drug traffickers, and the arrival of new law enforcement strategies. In death, he became a reference point in the story of how that older underworld order ended. The bomb that killed him was a break from past practice in more ways than one. It represented not only a departure from traditional mafia caution about tactics that endangered bystanders, but also a repudiation of the unwritten understandings that had once governed internal disputes. That act of betrayal, coming from within his own circle, sent a message that reverberated through the organization. No position was secure enough to guarantee safety, and no custom was inviolable when ambition and fear combined. For today's viewers or readers encountering his story, there is a temptation to treat it as a closed chapter, anchored firmly in a specific historical moment. In many ways, it is. The particular configuration of ethnic enclaves, labor unions, and urban politics that shaped Testa's rise no longer exists in the same form. Philadelphia's organized crime landscape has been transformed, its once dominant figures imprisoned, deceased, or greatly diminished. South Philadelphia itself has changed character, its streets reflecting a wider mix of cultures and occupations than in the mid-20th century. Yet the underlying questions his life raises remain relevant. How do economic marginalization and social networks intersect to make organized crime appealing to some and repellent to others? What kinds of law enforcement and community responses are most effective at disrupting entrenched criminal systems without stigmatizing entire neighborhoods or ethnic groups? How do myths about honor among thieves and codes of silence shape both public perception and the self-understanding of those inside such organizations? In reflecting on Testa, it is also important to consider how history remembers figures associated with wrongdoing. On the one hand, there is a duty to document and analyze their actions, because those actions had real consequences for communities and institutions. On the other, there is a risk that excessive focus on the personalities of mob bosses can overshadow the experiences of their victims or inadvertently lend a sense of dark glamour to their lives. Responsible storytelling about figures like Testa seeks to navigate that tension by grounding narrative in verifiable fact, emphasizing the human costs of organized crime, and resisting the urge to turn complex realities into simple archetypes. Some of that balance can be found in the way those who knew him in different capacities chose to speak about him later. Former associates who turned against the organization and cooperated with law enforcement often recalled Testa with a mixture of respect and regret. Respect for his perceived steadiness and adherence to certain internal rules, regret for the harm that his leadership enabled, and for the choices they had made in following him. Neighbors and extended acquaintances, when interviewed years after his death, tended to emphasize his quiet demeanor and family presence, while acknowledging that everyone knew he was involved in things best not discussed. These fragments do not coalesce into a simple moral, but they do highlight one of the central truths of his story, that men like Philip Charles Testa operated at the intersection of the ordinary and the illicit. They were recognizable figures in their communities, men seen at church, in shops, at family events, who nonetheless directed or participated in activities that injected fear and corruption into those same spaces. That duality is part of what makes the study of organized crime both challenging and necessary. It forces a confrontation with the ways in which harmful systems can root themselves in familiar, even cherished, social structures. In the end, the significance of Testa's life lies less in any single dramatic moment than in the arc it traces across decades of American urban history. Beginning with a child brought from Sicily to a struggling immigrant neighborhood, passing through years of gradual ascent in a local underworld, and culminating in a brief, contested hold on power cut short by internal treachery, his trajectory reflects the rise and partial fall of a particular model of organized crime. The violence that ended his life helped set in motion events that would, within a decade, bring heavy legal consequences down on many of his successors. For contemporary audiences, the enduring value of examining his story is not to fixate on the lurid details of mob intrigue, but to understand how such figures emerge, how they operate, and how their actions ripple outward through communities. In studying Philip Testa, we gain insight into the broader processes by which criminal organizations embed themselves in social and economic systems, and into the ways societies can, gradually and with difficulty, disentangle themselves from that grip. The row house on Porter Street, once the scene of a nighttime explosion that jolted a neighborhood awake, now stands as just another building on a South Philadelphia block. But the history bound up in that address, of migration, ambition, loyalty, fear, and betrayal, remains a vivid chapter in the story of the city and of organized crime in America. To follow the life of the man who lived there is to trace the contours of that chapter from its quiet beginnings to its violent end, and to confront the complex legacy it has left behind.